Gilbert hated time. What a tyrant it was. The hours that crawled by when his father was at sea. Seconds that whipped past when he was playing a brilliant game in the garden with the Limburger children. The eternity it took for summer to arrive at the beach at the bottoms of the cliffs, the flashing instant before summer stole over them again, and his father took to the sea once more. You can't hate time, Emmy said, the oldest of the three Limburgers and the only girl. She was used to talking to younger boys out of their foolishness. It's just time. Gilbert stopped pacing the treehouse floor and pointed a finger at her. That's why you're wrong. He thumped the book he had taken out of his father's bookcase, a book fetched home from London, heavy and well-made and swollen by the damp air of the sea crossing home to America. He hadn't read the book, but his tutor, Sour Senor Iriarte, had explained to him the day before while he was penned up inside, watching summer whiz past the study's windows. Time just isn't time. Time is also space. It's also a dimension. Gilbert thumped the book again for emphasis and opened it to the page he marked with a wide blade of sawgrass. See, this is a point. That's one dimension. It doesn't have length or depth. Just a dot. When you add another dimension, you get lines. He pointed at the next diagram with a chewed and dirty fingernail. You can go back and you can go forward, but you can go or move around the surface, although as if the world are on a page, but you can't go up and down, not until you add another dimension. He pointed to the diagram of the cube, stabbing at it so hard his finger dented the page. That's 3 dimensions, up and down, side to side, and out, in and out. Emmy rolled her eyes with the eloquence of a 13-year-old girl whose tutor had already explained all this to her. Gilbert smiled. Em would be a year older than he was, but that didn't mean he would always be dumber than she was. And Mr. Einstein, who was the smartest man in the whole history of the world, he has absolutely proved that time is just another dimension. Just like space. Time is what happens when you can go up and down, side to side, in and out, and before and after. Em opened her mouth and closed it. Her twin brothers, Erwin and Neil, snickered at the sight of her sister. Their sister struck them. She glared at them, then at Gilbert. That's stupid, she said. You're calling Einstein stupid? Of course not. But you must not understand him properly. Space is space. Time is time. Everyone knows that. Gilbert pretended he hadn't heard her. But here's the part no one knows. Why can't we move through space in any direction? You can't go up, Em said quickly. You got up into my treehouse, he said, putting a small emphasis on my. And he could go back down, too. Emmy, who was a better fighter than any of them, put her fists on their hips and mimed, "Make me." He pretended he didn't see it. Why can we move through space in almost any direction, but time only goes in one direction, at one speed? Why can't we go faster, slower, or backwards? Sideways? Neil said. He didn't speak often, but when he did, what he said was usually surprising. What's sideways in time? His twin asked. Neil shrugged. Sideways is sideways. This is dumb, Emmy declared. But Gilbert could see that she was getting in the spirit of things, starting to understand how it made him all so angry. Outside Gilbert's house, the summer roared past like a 3-masted schooner before a gale, with all its sails bellied out. Inside the study, the hours crawled by, and then in between, there were the breakfasts and dinners with Gilbert's father, who was home for the summer, and whose kind eyes were set into his ever-growing net of wrinkles and bags, who returned from his winter voyages each year a little thinner, a little more frail. And what did you learn today, boy? He asked. He said as he tucked into the mountain of lentils and beans made by the housekeeper, Mrs. Cory. He was so old that she actually once served as his father's nanny and changed his diapers, which always made Gilbert giggle when he thought of it. Father was a strict vegetarian and swore by his diet's life-enhancing properties, though that didn't seem to stop him from growing older and older and older. Gilbert stopped fussing with his lentils and what he didn't like very much. Geography, he said, looking at his plate. We're doing the lowlands. He looked out in the sunset, the sun racing for another side of the planet, dragging them all back toward the winter. Belgium, 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 Belgium. His father laughed and smacked his hands on his thighs. Belgium, poor lad. I've been marooned there once or twice. Land of bankers and cheesemakers. Like hitting your head, Belgium. Because it feels so good when you stop. What else? I want to do more physics, but Senor says I don't have the math for it. His father nodded judiciously. He would know. Why physics? Time, he said simply. They talked of time all summer in those few hours when Gilbert wasn't with his tutor and when Father wasn't sitting in his desk working at his accounts or riding into town to huddle over the telephone, casting his will over the place and time, trying to keep his ships and their cargoes in proper and correct motion. Why time, Gil? You're 11, son. You have lots of time. You can worry about time when you're an old man. Gilbert pretended he hadn't heard. I was thinking more of ways, like the time is like space. If I was at sea, standing on the deck of a ship, I could see a certain waves before me, and if I turn around, I could see waves, small waves behind me. But the horizon cuts off the view in both directions. Time is like that. I can think back a certain ways, and the further back I try to remember, the fuzzier it gets, until I can't see it all. And I can't see forward. We'll have Cow War soon. Go to bed. Wake tomorrow, but no further. His father raised his furry eyebrows and smiled a genuine and delighted smile. But things separated by time affect each other in ways that events separated by space can't. A star dying on the other side of the universe so far away that its light hasn't yet had its time enough to crawl all the way to us can't have any effect on us. But things happened hundreds of years ago, like the planting of a seed that grew with the oak that made this table. He rattled his saucer on it, making his coffee sway like a rough chop. He waggled his eyebrows again. Yikes, Gilbert said. That hadn't occurred to him. What if time moved in every direction at every speed? Could you have a space where events at the far end of the galaxy affected us? He answered his own question. Of course, because the events could travel back in time, or, he fumbled, remembered Neil's. Sideways, he swallowed. What's sideways in time? He shrugged. Sideways is sideways. His father laughed until tears rolled down his cheeks, and Gilbert didn't have the heart to tell him that the phrase had been Neil's, because making his father laugh like that was like Christmas and his birthday and a day that beats all world into one. And then his father took him down the ocean, down the rough goat trail cut into the cliff, as sure-footed as a goat himself. He watched the sun disappear behind the waves, and they moved among the tide pools, swirling their hands in the warm, salty water to make the bioluminescent specks-sized organisms light up like fireworks. They sat out and watched the moon and the stars lying on their backs in the sand. Gilbert's head in the crook of his father's arm, and closed his eyes and let his father tell him stories about the sea and the places he had went in the long, lonely winters, while the waves went shh, shh, like the whisper of a mother who died giving birth to him. And then they picked their way back up the cliff by moonlight that was so bright it must have been day. A blue, white noon and shades of gray, and his father tucked up into bed as if he were 3 years old, smoothing the covers and kissing him on the forehead with a whiskery kiss. As he lay along a moment, there stretched sleepily out like a warm taffy, suspended on the edge of sleep, the thought occurred to him. What if space moved only in one direction, in 2 dimensions, like time? The year passed. For so long as Gilbert could remember, Summer's first messenger had been the postmaster, Mr. Ossinger, who rode his bicycle along the sea road to the house to deliver his father's telegram advising him of the expected arrival in port and the preparations to be made for him. Mrs. Cory usually signed for the letter and then knocked on the study door to deliver it into Gilbert's eager hands. But this year, while the rain howled outside the window when Senor Uriarte plodded it through the formation of the igneous rock, Mrs. Cory did not come and deliver the letter rescuing from geography. She didn't come to the door, though Senor had finished rocks and moved on to algebra and then to Shakespeare. Finally, the school day ended. Gilbert left Senor stirring through the coals of a study fire, adding logs against the unseasonal winds outside. Gilbert floated downstairs to the kitchen and as though trapped in a dream that compelled him to seek out the housekeeper, even though some premonition told him to hide away in his room for as long as possible. From behind, she seemed normal, her thin shoulders working as she beat at the batter of the night for the nice cake, cranking the mixture handles with slow, practiced turns. But when the door clicked shut behind him, she stopped working the beater, though her shoulders kept working, shuddering, rising, falling. She turned her face to him, and he let out a cry and took a step back toward the door. It was as if she had been caught by an onrush of time, one that aged her, turning her from an old woman to an animated corpse. Every wrinkle seemed to have sunk deeper. Her fine floss hair hung limp across her forehead. Her eyes were red and leaked steady rills of tears. She took a step toward him, and he wanted to turn and run, but now he was frozen. So he stood, rooted to the spot, while she came and took him up in her frail arms and clutched him, sobbing dry, raspy sobs. "He's not coming home," she whispered into his ear, the whiskers on her chin tickling at him. "He's not coming home, Gilbert. Oh, oh, oh." He held her and patted her, and the time around him seemed to crawl by, slow enough that he could visualize every sweet moment he had had with his father. Time enough to visualize every storm his father had ever narrated to him. Had all time and more before Senor Uriarte came downstairs for his tea and found them in the kitchen. He gathered up frozen Gilbert and carried him to his bedroom, removed his shoes, and sat with him for hours until he finally slept. When morning dawned, the storm had lifted. Gilbert went to his window to see the stupid blue sky with its awful yellow sun, and realized that his father was gone forever and ever, to the end of time. Emmy and her brothers were queasy for him for the first week of summer, playing with him as though he were made of china or tainted with plague. By the second week, they were back to something like normal, scampering up the trees and down the cliffs, ranging farther and farther afield on their bicycles. Most of all, they were playing down at the switch yards, the old rail line that ran from disused freight docks on a few miles down the beach from their houses. Senor and Mrs. Cory didn't know what to do with him that summer, lacking any direction from Father, and so Gilbert made the most of it, taking Limburgers out on longer and longer trips, their packs bursting with food and water and useful tools, screwdrivers, crowbars, cans of oil. Somebody probably owned the switchyard, but whoever that was, he was far away and had no interest in it in Gilbert's lifetime. It had been decades since their freighters came to this harbor, and freight trains had taken their cargoes off into the land on the rusted rails. The rusted padlocks on the utility sheds crumbled and fell to bits at the lightest touches from the crowbars. The doors squealed open on their ancient hinges. Inside the cobwebby, musty room yielded a million treasures. Old timetables, telegraphs, rig, stiff denim coveralls with material as thick as the hall carpet at home, ancient whiskey bottles, a leather-bound journal that went to powder when they touched it, and a handcar. It'll never work, said Emmy. That thing's older than dinosaurs. It's practically rusted through. Gilbert hadn't heard her. Pretended he hadn't heard her. He wished he could move the car a little closer to the grimy windows. It was almost impossible to make sense of it in the deep shadows of the shed. He pushed hard on the handle, putting his weight into it. It gave a groan, a squeal, another groan. Then he moved an inch. That was a magic inch. He got his oil can and lavishly applied the 40 weight oil to every bearing that he could find. Niels and Irwin held the lamp. Emmy leaned in closer. He pushed the handle again, and another groan, and much higher squeal when the handle sank under his weight. The handlebar rumbled forward, almost crushing Emmy's foot. If she hadn't been so quick to leap back, she might have been crippled. She didn't seem to mind. She, her brothers, and Gilbert were all staring at the handcars as if to say, "Where have you been all my life?" They christened it Kalamazoo, and they worked it with oil and muscle until they moved out into the doorway. They cut their fingers and ribbons and turned their shins into fields of bruises, but it was all worth it because of what it promised. Motion without end. The track and the switchyard went in two directions, inland toward the nation and its hurrying progress, and its infinite hunger for materials and blood and work, and out to sea, stretching out on a rock bed across the harbor, to the breakers where the great boats were too large for the shallow harbor that used to tie up to offload. Once they had bullied Kalamazoo onto the tracks, using blocks, winches, levers, in a total disregard for their own safety. They stood to either side of the bogey handle and stared from side to side. Each knew what the others were thinking. Do we pump for the land or pump for the sea? Tomorrow, Gilbert said. It was the end of August now, and lessons would soon begin again, and each day it felt like something was drawing to a close. Tomorrow, Gilbert said, we'll decide tomorrow. Bring supplies. That night, by unspoken agreement, they all packed their treasures. Gilbert laid out his sailor suit. His father bought him a new one each year. And his book about time and space, and stuffed a picnic blanket with Mrs. Curie's preserves, hardtack bread, jars of lemonade, and apples from the cellar. Mrs. Curie, 3/4 deaf, slept through his raid. Gilbert then went to his father's study and took the spyglass that belonged to his grandfather, who had also been lost at sea. He opened the small oak box holding Granddad's sextant, but as he never mastered it, he set it down. He took his father's enormous silver chased turnip watch and tried on his rain boots and discovered that they fit. The last time he tried them on, he could have gotten both feet into one of them. Time passed without his noticing, but his feet had noticed. He hauled the bundles out on the hedgerow at the bottom of the driveway and then put himself to bed. In an instant, he was asleep. An instant later, the sun was shining on his face. He woke, put on a sailor suit, went downstairs and shouted hello to Mrs. Curie, who smiled a misty smile to see him in his sailor suit. She gave him hot cakes with butter and cherries from the tree behind Signor's shed, a glass of milk and a mountain of fried potatoes. He ate until his stomach couldn't hold anymore, said goodbye to her, and walked to the bottom of the hedgerow to retrieve his secret bundle. He wrestled it with Nicholas' basket and wobbled it down to the Limburger's gate to meet his friends, each with a bundle on the bike. The half-hour ride to the switchyard took so little time that it was over even before Gilbert had a chance to think about what he was doing. Time was going by too fast for thoughts now, like a train that had hit its speed and could now only be perceived by a blur of passing cars and racket of wheels and steam. Kalamazoo was still beaded with dew as they began to unload their bundles on the platform. Gilbert had set down his farthest from the sea, and Emmy set hers down at the farther end of the land, and when they stood to either side of the pump handle, it was clear that Emmy wanted to push for the land while Gilbert wanted to push them out to the sea. Naturally. Emmy looked at Gilbert, and Gilbert looked at Emmy. Gilbert took out his grandfather's spyglass, lifted off the leather cap from the business end, extended it, and pointed out to sea, sweeping from side to side, looking farther than they'd ever seen. Wordlessly, he held it out to Emmy, who turned around to face the bay and swept it with a telescope. Then she handed it off to Niels and Irwin, who took their turns. Nothing more had to be said. They leaned together in a stiff lever and controlled Kalamazoo's direction of travel, and threw it into position and set out to pumping out to sea. What the spyglass showed, waves and waves and waves and waves. And farther along, the curvature of the planet itself, as it warped toward Europe and Africa and the rest of the world, it showed a spit of land, graced with the ancient and crumbling seafort, shrouded in mist and overgrown with weeds and trees and long disuse. And beyond it, waves and more waves. The gentle sea breeze turned off into a stiff wind once they pumped for an hour. The handcart at first rolling slowly on the planing wheels, and then, as the rust flaked off the axles and bearing found at their old accommodations, they spun against one another easily. The pumping was still hard work, and even though they traded off, the children soon grew tired and sore, and Emmy called for a rest stop and a snack. As they munched their sandwiches, Gilbert had a flash. "We could use this for a sail," he said, nudging his picnic basket with one toe. Niels and Irwin, whose shorter arms suffered more from the pumping labor, loved the idea and set to rigging a mast for their fishing poles and the long crowbar they lashed to Kalamazoo's side. Emmy and Gilbert let them do the work, watching with the wisdom of age, eating sandwiches and enjoying the breeze that dried up their sweat. As they started up again, Kalamazoo seemed as fresh from the rest as they were. And it rolled more easily than ever. The sail bellowed out before the mast. When Gilbert and Emmy stopped the trade pumping duties back to the twins, Kalamazoo continued to roll, propelled by the stiff wind alone. All four children made themselves comfortable at the back of the pump car, and allowed time for the space to whip past them as they would. "We're moving through space like time," Gilbert said. Emmy quirked her mouth at him, an unfamiliar no-nonsense look that he ignored. We are, he said, moving in a straight line from behind to front, at a rate we can't control. Off to the sides are spaces we could move through, but we are not. We are on through the rails and can't go sideways, can't go back, can't go up or down. We can't control our speed. We are space's slaves. This is just how we move through time. Emmy shook her head. Neil seemed excited by the idea, though he nudged his own twin, and they muttered in their curious twinish dialect to one another. The sea fort was visible with the naked eye now. With a spyglass, Gilbert could make out its brickwork and the streaks of guano that ran down its cracked walls. The rails ran right through the fort, last used as a customs inspection point, and past it to the hidden docks on the other side of the spit. Better hope the wind shifts, Emmy said, holding a weighted finger out to check the breeze. Otherwise, we're going to have a devil of a time pumping ourselves home in time for supper. Gilbert drew out the turnip watch, which he had set this morning by the big grandfather clock in the front hall, carefully winding its spring. He opened his face and checked out the second hand. It seemed to be spinning a little more slowly, but that could have been his imagination. According to the watch, it was nearly 11, and they had been on the rail for 3 hours. I think we'll make the fort home in time for lunch, he said. At the mention of food, Niels and Irwin clamored for snacks, and Emmy found them cookies she'd snitched from the big jar in Limburger kitchen. Gilbert looked at the watch for a moment, and then the second hand stopped moving. He held it up to his ear. He wasn't precisely ticking any longer, but rather making it sound like a truck wheel spinning in spring mud. He closed the lid again and held it so tight that the intricate scrolling on the case dug into his palm. Time passed, and then it didn't. And then it did again. Oh, said Niels and Irwin together. To either side of the car, stretching into an infinity, were more tracks running across the endless harbor, each with its own car, its own sail, its own children. Some were edging ahead of them, some were going backwards. A racket overhead had all of them look up at once. At the tracks, too, the rails and the cars and Limburgers and the Gilberts and them. Some children were older, some were younger. One Gilbert was weeping. One was a girl. Gilbert waved his hand, and 100 Gilberts waved back. One made a rude gesture. Oh, said Emmy. To her right, another Emmy was offering her a sandwich. She took it and handed over the last of her cookies, and Emmy smiled at herself and said thank you as politely as you could wonder. Sideways is sideways, Niels and Irwin said together. Emmy and Gilbert nodded. Gilbert pulled out his spyglass and looked ahead at the fort. All the rails converged on it, but without ever meeting. And some stretched beyond, and some out there, somewhere, it was a time like space, and space like time. And somewhere out there was a father on a ship that weathered the storm rather like then succumbed to it. Gilbert turned to his friends and shook each of their hands in return. Niels was crying a little. Emmy gave Gilbert a friendly punch in the shoulder, then a hug. There was another Kalamazoo to the right, and Gilbert was pretty sure he could make out the easy leap from the car to it. And the next car, and the next. And beyond, into the infinite sideways. If there was an answer, he'd find it there.